One of the most famous and sensational organized crime groups in Russia and Kazan, Khadi Taktash, appeared in the early 80s. It was named after the street where the main members of the group grew up. The street, in turn, was named after a famous poet of Tatar origin. The organized crime group existed for quite a long time. It experienced many flourishes and falls. The group was engaged in racketeering, drug trafficking, pimping, contract murders, money laundering. The emergence of the group. Like many other organized crime groups in Kazan, Khadi Taktash appeared in the early 80s. Then numerous gangs consisting of young people and opposing each other began to appear in Kazan. At first, this wave swept the outskirts of the city, and then it spread to the whole of Kazan. The groups began to divide the asphalt, i.e. the territory where they were located, and fiercely fought over it, often using rebar and other tools. At the same time, the number of juvenile gangsters was so high that it was even difficult to count them. For example, in 86, the police had a list of 3,500 gangsters. The Komsomol indicated that 70 gangs were active in Kazan. At the same time, the author of the book The Word of a Patsan, which was used as a basis for the TV series that stirred up the public, says that the number of gangs was up to 150. Clashes took place not only street to street, but even yard to yard. In general, there was a clear hierarchy in such gangs. The youngest were the husks, or shells, older teenagers were the supers, and the oldest were the elders. If someone was not in a group, he could be beaten and robbed with impunity. This is exactly how Khadi Taktash started her activities in the old days. In the 90s, many gangsters became members of full-fledged organized crime groups. Khadi Taktash appeared in 1982 in Kazan in the Vakitovsky district. Then teenagers who lived at the intersection of Jdanov Street, now Nursultan Nazarbayev Street, and Khadi Taktash formed a group. Some of its experienced members had already had problems with the law in the past and had actually served time in prison. In the early years, the group beat and robbed passers-by and fought with other gangs. In the early 1990s, when the USSR collapsed, members of the Khadi Taktash group Vladimir Didenko, Rustem Bariv and Ilsur Valev went to conquer the capital and disappeared. They were followed by several other people who also disappeared. In 1994, the bodies of several of the missing were found in a sewer in Moscow. They had been dismembered. The others had probably been killed as well, but their bodies were not found. At this time, the OCG itself was in a difficult situation. It was divided into two parts, old and young. The young sought money and power, while the old wanted to preserve the traditions of the group. Anvar Khaliulin was at the head of the young, and Rauf Sharafuddinov was at the head of the old. The young went into business and quickly managed to control Orgsintez. It was a large plant in Kazan. The older ones wanted to get a share from the younger ones, but these attempts were firmly suppressed. As a result, the leader of the younger ones, Anvar, was soon killed with a shotgun. The response followed quite quickly. Sharafuddinov was killed in the same way. Nikolai Gusev became the new leader of Khadi Taktash, and his right hand was Radik Galyakberov, Raja, as he was nicknamed. Later it was Raja who became the leader of the group when Nikolai left for Spain. The Khadishevskis, as the members of the Khadi Taktash organized crime group were called, cleaned out all the old gang members, even those who had retired, and continued to do business. They took control of all of Kazan's prostitution and also began to sell drugs. According to the police, they were selling a kilogram of heroin a day. In addition, the bandits soon began to control the super profitable industry of ritual services. In the turnover got also banks, restaurants, factories, companies, and even cemeteries. Golden years, Khadi Taktash. Up to a certain point, the group behaved relatively calmly. Then they had internal squabbles, which led to the murders of several members of the OCG. There were fights among themselves. Someone was stealing common stock. Someone was working for other OCGs. In general, the Kadishevs had a lot to do. It is believed that the group reached its peak in 1997. At that time, the organized crime group already had a clear hierarchy. The group had fighters, intelligence, and even counterintelligence, all using pseudonyms and phrases with hidden meanings. For example, the investigation found that the phrase "we made Venus" denoted a dismembered man. There were meetings and planning meetings for which it was impossible to be late, otherwise you could be seriously punished. In Kazan, the most serious enemy of Khadi Taktash was the group Zhilka, OPG, Zilploschatka, which was led by Haidar Zakirov. Zilka then began to pay attention to St. Petersburg, and Zakirov was killed. Other opponents of the Hadishevskys were the Pervaki OCG with the leader of Bibik, Albert Batrov. With the latter, there were many showdowns, including shootings, on which many people were killed and wounded. The end of the group. The investigation established that in total there were 4 groups in Khadi Taktash, the Khadishevsky themselves, as well as Cemetery, Volokhaevsky and Razhov. Many members of the OCG began to be arrested in 1999. Many of them were put on the wanted list. In 2000, the leader of the Volokhaevsky, Mars Gizatulin, was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but after some time he was shot in his car. In 1999, Anatoly Novitsky, who was a hitman in Khadi Taktash, was detained. He killed the leader of one of Kazan's organized crime groups and was caught. He testified against Radik Galiakberov. At the end of 1999, members of the Khadi Taktash group were arrested, including Galiakberov. Many of the OCG members did not testify. Novitsky also began to retract his words, saying that he did it under pressure from police officers. The investigation was long and complicated. Law enforcers had to neutralize not only individual members of the organized crime group, but an entire criminal network. Also, during the investigation, a witness protection program was used, for the first time in the history of modern Russia. Members of the investigative bodies were brought to the courts wearing overcoats that concealed their figure and masks. From this, it can be understood how serious Khadi Taktash was, that even law enforcers were afraid of it. Witnesses at the trials were in other rooms. Their voices were changed, and makeup was applied. The organized crime group even gave an ultimatum to the government of Tatarstan to release Raja or Mintimir Shaimiev, then president of the republic, would be eliminated. The investigation estimated that Khadi Taktash had 60 murders on his account, but they were able to prove only 13. The court hearings were difficult. They were postponed or witnesses magically died, but the verdicts were still announced. Many members of the organized crime group received from 6 to 24 years in prison. Fakhrudinov and Galiakberov received life sentences and are serving their sentences in the Black Dolphin colony. They tried to appeal the sentences, but to no avail. The group had 15 lawyers. Many are convinced that the group was liquidated thanks to the successfully implemented witness protection program. Raja, who had already received a sentence, was often approached by law enforcement agencies for help. He actively helped them. For example, he helped investigate the murder of Aybat Aybatov, director of the Krasny Vostok plant in Kazan. For this, Galiakberov was relaxed in terms of conditions of detention. He can be understood, because his way out of the Black Dolphin was only to the cemetery. Nevertheless, Radik did not abandon his attempts to convince everyone that he was innocent. For example, he complained to the relevant authorities of the Orenburg region and even wrote complaints to Yuri Chaika, the former prosecutor general of the Russian Federation. Galiakberov considers his sentence unjust.